Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that every dollar in your wallet buys just a little less than it did yesterday. Not because someone stole your money, not because your salary changed, but because the value of money itself quietly shifted. That is inflation. And despite being one of the most discussed economic concepts in the world, it is also one of the most misunderstood. Most people think inflation simply means prices are going up. That's true, but it's only the visible symptom. The real story is far deeper. Inflation is the changing relationship between money and the production of real goods and services. It is not merely an increase in prices. It is the gradual erosion of purchasing power caused by an imbalance between demand, supply, productivity, expectations, credit creation, government policy, demographics, global trade, and psychology. In other words, inflation is not a single event. It is a system. Let's begin with a simple thought experiment. Imagine an island with 100 people. Every year, they produce 100 houses, 1,000 chickens, 10,000 loaves of bread, and enough clothing for everyone. The island also has exactly $1 million circulating. Everything functions smoothly because money represents actual production. Now imagine the government suddenly doubles the money supply. Do the people instantly produce twice as many houses? No. Twice as many farms? No. Twice as many factories? No. Production remains identical. But suddenly everyone possesses more money chasing exactly the same quantity of goods. Prices begin rising, not because products became more valuable, but because money became less scarce. This is the first principle of inflation. Money is only valuable because it is scarce relative to what it can purchase. However, reality is considerably more complex. Modern economies rarely experience inflation from a single cause. Instead, inflation is the outcome of multiple forces interacting simultaneously. Economists often classify inflation into several categories. Demand pull inflation occurs when consumers, businesses, and governments collectively spend faster than the economy can expand production. Imagine a booming economy. Employment is high, consumers are confident, banks are lending aggressively, companies invest heavily. Governments increase spending. Demand rises across nearly every sector. Factories begin operating near full capacity. Workers become difficult to hire. Raw materials become harder to obtain. Businesses discover they can raise prices without losing customers. Inflation begins. Not because supply collapsed, because demand exceeded productive capacity. The second major force is cost-push inflation. Here, prices increase because production itself becomes more expensive. Energy prices rise, shipping costs increase, raw materials become scarce, labor costs climb. Businesses now face higher operating expenses. Companies have only three choices: accept lower profits, increase productivity, or raise prices. Many choose the third option. Consumers experience inflation even though demand may not have changed. The inflation originated from the supply side. Then comes one of the most fascinating forms, monetary inflation. This is where central banking enters the picture. Modern money is not simply printed. Much of it is created digitally through commercial banking. Every time a bank issues a loan, new purchasing power enters the economy. Credit expands, investment expands, consumption expands. Asset prices often rise before consumer prices do. This distinction is critical. Many people think inflation starts at the grocery store. Frequently, it begins years earlier inside financial markets. Stocks appreciate. Real estate climbs. Luxury assets become more expensive. Only later does broader consumer inflation emerge. Asset inflation often serves as the first warning signal. Now, consider expectations. Inflation is not purely mathematical. It is psychological. If workers believe prices will increase 5% next year, they negotiate higher wages today. Businesses expecting higher wages increase prices today. Suppliers anticipating higher costs raise quotations today. Consumers expecting future price increases accelerate purchases today. These behaviors collectively create exactly the inflation everyone feared. Economists call this inflation expectations. Sometimes expectations become self-fulfilling. Confidence, or the lack of it, becomes an economic variable. Now let's introduce productivity, one of the least appreciated inflation fighters. Suppose a factory once produced 1,000 vehicles using 100 workers. After automation, robotics, and artificial intelligence, the same factory now produces 2,000 vehicles using the same workforce. Production doubled. Labor efficiency doubled. Supply increased dramatically. Prices can stabilize despite rising wages. This is why technological revolutions often create powerful disinflationary forces. Productivity expands the economy's capacity without requiring proportional increases in labor or capital. More output, same resources, lower inflationary pressure. Globalization also transformed inflation over recent decades. When companies manufacture products wherever production is most efficient, consumers benefit from lower prices. Competition intensifies. Domestic producers cannot arbitrarily increase prices. Imports discipline inflation. However, globalization can reverse. Trade conflicts emerge, supply chains fracture, tariffs increase production costs, strategic industries relocate closer to home. Resilience replaces efficiency. These shifts frequently increase production expenses. Inflation rises not because demand changed, but because the global cost structure changed. Now, let's discuss wages. Many people assume higher wages automatically create inflation. Reality is more nuanced. If wages rise because workers become more productive, inflation may remain stable. Companies produce more value per employee. Higher salaries reflect higher output. However, if wages increase significantly while productivity stagnates, businesses face increasing labor costs without generating additional production. Prices often rise. This phenomenon contributes to what economists call a wage-price spiral. Workers seek higher wages because prices increased. Businesses raise prices because wages increased. The cycle reinforces itself. Breaking this cycle is notoriously difficult. Now we arrive at one of the most misunderstood concepts: interest rates. Higher interest rates do not directly reduce inflation. They reduce demand. Borrowing becomes more expensive. Mortgage payments rise. Business loans become less attractive. Consumers postpone purchases. Investment slows. Construction slows. Credit creation slows. Demand cools. Inflation gradually declines. Notice something important. Interest rates treat the demand side. If inflation originates from supply shortages, higher interest rates may have limited effectiveness while simultaneously slowing economic growth. This explains why policymakers constantly analyze the source of inflation before deciding on monetary policy. Not all inflation behaves the same. Another overlooked factor is fiscal policy. Governments influence inflation not only through taxation, but also through spending. Massive infrastructure investment during periods of full employment may stimulate additional demand. Deficit financing can inject purchasing power into the economy. Tax reductions increase disposable income. Subsidies affect relative prices. Government decisions constantly alter inflation dynamics. Fiscal policy and monetary policy often operate simultaneously. Sometimes they reinforce one another. Sometimes they work against each other. Understanding inflation requires understanding both. Let's move beyond consumer prices. Inflation exists in multiple dimensions. Consumer inflation affects groceries, fuel, healthcare, transportation, and services. Producer inflation affects manufacturers. Asset inflation influences housing, equities, collectibles, and land. Commodity inflation impacts oil, metals, agriculture, and industrial inputs. Wage inflation changes labor costs. Each category influences the others through complex feedback loops. Professional analysts rarely monitor only one inflation indicator. They observe the entire inflation ecosystem. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: inflation is rarely random. It usually reflects structural imbalances. Sometimes demand outpaces supply. Sometimes governments overspend. Sometimes credit expands excessively. Sometimes productivity stagnates. Sometimes geopolitics disrupts production. Sometimes demographics shift labor markets. Sometimes confidence itself changes behavior. Inflation is the economy communicating that something fundamental has become unbalanced. Prices are merely the language through which that message is delivered. So when someone asks, what causes inflation? The honest answer is not one sentence. Inflation emerges from the interaction between monetary policy, fiscal policy, productivity, demographics, energy, logistics, expectations, global trade, labor markets, technological innovation, and human psychology. No single graph explains it. No single statistic defines it. It is one of the most sophisticated equilibrium problems in economics. And perhaps that is why inflation continues to surprise markets, policymakers, investors, and sometimes entire nations. Because inflation is never simply about prices. It is about trust. Trust in money. Trust in institutions. Trust in productivity. Trust in future economic stability. When that trust changes, everything else eventually follows. And that is why inflation remains one of the most powerful and least understood forces shaping the modern global economy.